So let's assume all this is dried, and now you're going to start working on the motor tube again. So now we're going to this assembly here, and you can see again I've eliminated a lot of the parts that we're not going to use. And basically out of all this, we're only going to be attaching the third centering ring to the top of the motor ring, and we're going to substitute the hardware. So I've marked out all the steps, and basically the only two steps that we're going to do is applying cement to the centering ring and then putting the hardware in. So here's the changes. You take the centering ring, the top one, you basically draw yourself a line 1/4 inch from the top edge, and you push the centering ring on. Again, you make sure the notch lines up with your line that you have on the tube. You come down 1/4 inch and then you glue it in place. And I would put glue on both sides and let that sit. Once all that's dried, we're going to substitute the hardware. In this assembly, they're using the baffle mesh plastic to adjust this eye bolt but this connection is very weak and we're not using that. So what I suggest is go to Lowe's and get a 1/4 eye bolt. Get a standard screw, 2 flat washers, and what's not illustrated here but I think you should get one of those nylon locking nuts instead of a standard nut, which is what I've got here. Get this as an assembly, and what you're going to do is you're going to drill a hole once this is dried halfway between where it meets the motor lock and the exterior. Drill a clearance hole so this can go through, and what you're going to do is you're going to snug this up with a flat washer on one side of this centering hole and the nut facing down. So you want the eye bolt facing upwards of the tube, away from the fins. And I'll try to give you a shot of what this looks like when it's done. So if you follow the instructions, this is what you would end up with. You can see in this case, this is the plastic mesh baffle, and they put the eye bolt on top of that, and all it is it's screwed into that plastic, and it's a very weak connection, and a sudden jolt on the parachute, particularly with the added weight of these reloads, could yank that out. So what you're going to have instead is when you look down when the rocket is finished, you'll see a clear passage to the motor tube, and I've tried to show you on the fiberglass one I built. This is what I did, and if you look down there, you can see right through the motor tube, and that top is the centering ring. That's what we want. If you can see that, see the bigger eye bolt? I've mounted it halfway in between the motor tube and the body tube, and I've turned it where it is parallel with the body tube. So what you want there, and if you can look in there and see, I've also got a connection like one of those bolts to hook it to. There you can see it pretty well. So what we would do, if you can see, I hope I'm explaining this well enough. Instead of that, we're putting this like that, about midway. That's what you want. You want to drill a hole, put this through, and that's the reason we're putting it on now, because you can get the bottom side of the nut when you actually drill it on. So when you're all said and done, if you can imagine a centering ring here, you're going to have a nut a flat washer, and then another flat washer, which I can't see. Oh, here it is, on the other side of the centering ring, and then you'll have your nylon locking bolt. And basically the assembly, once you turn the eye bolt correctly, should look like that. So when you look down into the rocket, you'll see the top of the motor tube, you'll see the centering ring, and you'll see this eye bolt coming through. Now, the other hardware that you should get is you should get two of these, I don't know what they call them, but these hooks here. And in this case, you're going to tie your shock cord to this, and ultimately you're going to hook that to the eye bolt. That's going to be the connection point for the shock cord. So I hope that's not confusing, but this is what we're doing in substitute for these two. So the instructions say, apply cement to the front surface of the baffle flange and place aero fiber centering over the front end of the baffle where we're not putting the baffle. So this is just where you're taking the centering ring, you're coming 1/4 inch down, you're lining the little cutaway in the centering ring with your line, put adhesive on both sides. Then, instead of doing the mounting they say in step 6, you're drilling a hole in the centering ring halfway between the motor and the outer edge of the centering ring. You're putting this through, you're putting a nut and a washer on the top side, and you're putting a washer and a locking nylon nut on the bottom side, and you cinch that up, and ultimately you turn this eye bolt where it is parallel with the edge of the rocket. After you put that in, I would recommend putting some adhesive on both sides on the screw, because the idea is you don't want that coming off. So believe it or not, that's probably the most confusing change. So hopefully that's clear enough for you. Okay, so once you've got the third centering at the top and you got your hardware mounted and you glued, I would set this aside, let this dry for another 24 hours. And now, assuming this is your second day, your putty on this tube should have dried. So now I would take some sandpaper, anywhere from 200 to 100 grit, go over this, and you'll be taking most of the putty off, but you'll be leaving putty in these grooves, and you basically want to repeat this process, sanding and adding putty, until just to the touch you don't feel any significant bumps or any divots. The primer is going to fill in some as well, but we want to do as much with the putty as we can. So depending on how well it came out the first time, you may want to do a second time to get this tube all ready. So before we start on page 4, the assumption is all the assemblies on the motor tube have dried, the hardware is dried, and now you're getting ready to introduce the motor tube to the body tube and to the fin. So this is where it kind of all comes together. So step 1 says, using a hobby knife, carefully remove any body tube material that may still be attached to any pre-cut slots in the body tube. So if you did that as I instructed before, you probably don't have to do any more. That's already taken care of. Now you insert the loose end of the shock cord. Now what I didn't say is you're going to take the shock cord, and you're going to loop it through this connector here, and then you're going to tie a slip knot. So here I've tied my slip knot. I'm going to cinch that up to where it's tight, like so. And now get some masking tape. So with masking tape, I just loop it around and basically taking all the loose ends, the knot and everything, we mask and tape that to the shock cord. And when you push all this together, you'll be surprised at how well that'll hold everything together, keep loose ends from getting in the way, and it basically keeps the knot from slipping. So it's something I learned. It's a pretty good trick. So anyway, so you're going to take this, and in your case, your hardware is going to be on your rocket. So you're going to go ahead and make this connection here to the eye bolt. So when your connection's made, and again, make sure your clamp will fit over the eye of the 1/4 20 eye bolt, but basically you secure it, and that's what it's going to look like when it's done. When all that's done, you're going to basically take the engine tube and you're going to pull the end of the shock cord through, the other end already being attached to the motor mount, and that's what they're talking about. So insert the loose end of the shock cord and then the motor tube assembly into the back end of the rocket tube as shown. Position the motor tube assembly so that the fin locks are located under the visible through the body tubes pre-cut. So you feed your shock cord through. Now you start feeding your motor tube, which now has the 2 centering rings glued in place. You slide it up into the tube, and you make sure your fin locks line up with the cutouts of the motor tube. So the motor tube, in this case, has the fin locks which you have punched out. You'll be basically putting the motor tube in and looking through here and twisting the motor tube until the fin locks line up and you can see them through the cutouts. So now you apply cement along the full length of the fin root of the fin. That's this edge right here. Surface, and carefully insert through the slot in the body tube and snap into place. Repeat this process for the other 2 fins. Each fin should be snug against the body. So what I've done is I made sure there was plenty of glue along this edge, bottom of the tab, along this edge. I also go inside from the back end of the motor tube with a dowel with some adhesive, and I put some adhesive all along the locks as well as the motor tube, so that when this comes in, it's hitting adhesive on both sides. So after you snap the fins in place, you let that dry, and when it's dry, now I would take a dowel, and that's why we left this centering ring off. Take a dowel and get your adhesive and go in there and just really liberally coat adhesive all inside where the fins connect, everything. You can't use too much adhesive. The only thing is, do not allow any adhesive to get on the back side of this ring, because you still got that other centering ring you got to put on there, and you don't want any adhesive to get in the way. So step 4, so through the back end of the body tube, apply cement where the fins tabs meet the motor tube, fin locks, front centering ring, and the body tube. Through the front end of the body tube, apply cement where the baffle assembly centering ring meets the inside of the surface of the body tube. So what they're talking about there is, here's your centering ring, and you want to make sure you put adhesive all along where the centering ring hits the body tube. And you also want to go from the back end as well, and apply cement to this centering ring where it touches the body tube. And that's the reason why they're leaving the bottom centering ring off. So when you've slid this up with the dowel from this side, you can put adhesive all around this centering ring. And then with a dowel from this side, you can get adhesive on all the fin points, all where the centering ring meets the inside of the motor tube. Okay. So now they say lightly sand the surface of the body tube around the launch lug location. So that was the 2 points. The other 2 points that you'd cleared out material. You apply cement to the base of the launch lug. With the sloping portion of the launch lug forward and the front of the body tube, insert the tab on the bottom of the lug onto one of the pre-cut launch lug slots in the body tube. Repeat this process for the other launch lug. Now, having done this before, you're basically putting these guys on here. So yeah, you want the sloping end pointed upwards. My advice is put the adhesive underneath these, put them on, and then put a piece of tape over them to hold them. You want these really snug and square with the tube, so put some tape around to hold it in place and let that dry. So one thing I learned from doing an Aerotech, this Initiator kit before, if you don't get those pre-cut areas cleared out really well, the guide piece doesn't sit flat, sits square with the rocket. So you want to make sure if you glue them down and you find that they're not sitting flat, I'd say put a knife, hobby knife in there and pop it off and re-glue it. But anyway, once you've done that, what I've done here is I've taken a section of the 1/4 inch rod. My launch pad comes with a 1/4 inch rod that you can unscrew and make a small section. But I put it through, and you want to be able to go through both of them and it slide back and forth pretty well. That's the idea. So before it dries, my recommendation is do the following. So let's assume you've put it on and you got glue that hasn't cured yet. This is what you'll do. So you should put some blue tape on both the guides and pull the tape down to where you should see the glue oozing out on both sides, but certainly make sure that the rail guide is flush and square with the rocket. So I wouldn't advise putting this launch rod in until you got the blue tape on, and then carefully put the rod through, and I would actually tape the rod in place like this. So you can see here I put the rod through and I put a piece of tape midway between the two guys and then another one here, not pulling down. I mean, you don't want to pull down to the point you're distorting the rod, but basically you should be able to twist the rod and kind of feel it moving without any resistance. That way when this all dries up, you know it's square relative to the rail guide, because that's the sole purpose for these anyway, and it rolls out real well. What you might do before you glue these is take a file, either before you glue them or after, and go inside both these rail guides to make sure there's not any flashing from the molding or anything that's in there. You want a really clear path without any resistance on this rail rod. So once it dries, check it to make sure it flows pretty good. So at this stage, you've got glue on the inside of the rocket. On this side, you got glue on this side. You got glue under the fins. You got glue on the launch side. You want this whole assembly to set up and dry really well. So at this point, you would have allowed this to cure for about a day, and then you take the blue tape off, and you can see I can spin it very well, and now I can do the test, and it's going in and out no problem. So that's what you want to feel, no resistance. Again, I would take the rod out, and you know, the rod should go all the way through and clear without any going of any sort, and then take a file maybe and go in there and just open up those so that they're very clear. You can see looking down here Make sure it's square and clear, and that will finish that up. Once it's dried, then come back and take the unit and sit it where it's kind of like this. And this is where you want to do the fillets. You want to put a bead of adhesive where the fins match the body tube. And this is where I said take like a plastic spoon and pull it across, or you can use your finger. The idea, like in this case, you want to get this where these two surfaces meet and with this kind of a gradual slope, what we call a fillet right here. And so you'll do it, and I recommend sitting it like this, doing those two, letting it dry, then rotating it because the adhesive will run. Do those two, let it dry, and then rotate and do the third. So come up with some fixture. You could actually use the box that I said earlier to set it up. But if you take your time and let that level out and dry, it comes out a lot better. So that then brings us, once this whole assembly here is dried, you then make sure you have all your adhesive from the back side. Now they're telling you to you slide the remaining centering over the back end of the motor tube and push it against the back fin lock ring. Apply a bead of cement where the centering ring meets the body tube. So that's all this back in here. So you basically, if I can get this to stand up, you're pushing, assuming you got all the adhesive inside you need, you push the remaining centering in, lining up the keyway with your line, and pushing it down until it stops flush against where the fin lock is. And again, you'll put adhesive all around between the centering ring and the body tube, and you also put a bead adhesive around the motor tube, and you let that dry, preferably sitting straight up. The next steps have been deleted, and this is when you glue the aero pack assembly. Now the aero pack here, you can see I take the ring off. You remove the outer ring while you're doing this, and basically this is where you bring your JB weld in. You take the inner ring, you put JB weld around the outer edge of the motor tube. You put JB weld on the inside edge of this inner ring, and then you should press this ring over the motor tube. You should do a test fit first because it may require a little bit of sanding on the motor tube. Sometimes these are a tight fit, but once the fit is good, you put the JB weld on, you push it on. Once it's pushed on, then take a rag and wipe any JB weld that may have oozed out. You don't want any bead of glue on the inside. This is a pretty snug fit for the CTI engine motor mount. So I mean, if you get some, you have to sand it later, but if you can wipe it out now, that would be better. So although this is a big ring, you'll notice there's a stop ring on the inside. That's where you're pushing. You can see the rib sections here. That helps grasp the motor tube. So basically the motor tube will come into here and would bottom out at that ridge. So this is the surface you put the JB weld. You push it on like so, and you let it dry. Once it's done and it's dried, the centering ring should be able to screw on like so. So assuming you do everything right, the way this works, you've got your motor tube, which if you did it right has nothing inside. You got your retention inner ring. You would then get your motor tube, motor tube should go in. You should probably do a test fit. It goes in like so. Goes all the way in. And you can see how the flange, the retaining ring of the engine tube, goes inside the retaining ring like so. And this enables you to put the cap on. And that is what holds the negative force. Positive force is with the motor tube against the engine casing, and the negative force is the retaining ring of the motor tube casing against this piece here. So that's how it goes in. So again, to take it out, you take the cap off. And we pull it up like so. So if that fits in and you can put the cap on, you've pretty much made all the modifications correctly. So we continue our assembly process on page 5. At the very top, I've circled these 2 steps because although we'll be doing these steps in this order, again, there's some slight modifications and enhancements that I think this video will help. So step 5 has you securing the shock cord to the nose cone. So the assumption is you have built the bottom end of the rocket. Obviously yours is not painted yet, but you would have already pushed through the shock cord, and it's attached to where, if we can see it, with our connection at the bottom. So I would not put the parachute on it this time, and I would go ahead and start most of your painting. At least get the primer on at this point. So one thing about painting, if you notice on mine where I've painted the nose cone, I painted this one just like the kit requires. So basically you're painting the nose cone red, and you're painting the whole bottom half white. All this rest is decal, so it makes it pretty easy. But before you start painting, take this section of the nose cone that goes inside the rocket and coat this with blue tape. If you've got some white or blue tape, it'll make it easier. You just don't want any paint in this section. And when you're painting the rocket, you also want to put some rags or some paper towels in this area, because you don't want paint going on in this area. The reason why is this pressure fit with the nose cone to the rocket is key. You want enough resistance such that the nose cone doesn't come off during flight and feeling a sudden increase in acceleration or deceleration, but at the same time you don't want it on so tight that the injection charge can't take it off. So it's good to leave this surface and the inside of the tube as pristine as possible. In fact, I would recommend maybe going over these edges here and on the inside with some sandpaper just to make sure it's smooth. There's a reason for this blue tape. I'll get into that a little later. But you should basically only be painting this section. So at this stage, if you weren't pleased with, if you look at the rocket and you still see little divots and stuff, go back and put your epoxy fillets, maybe sand those down and then add some more epoxy. You can add some of the wood filler and rough areas, sand it down, and then I would go ahead and spray the whole rocket with whichever primer you select. And let that dry and go over and light sand it with probably like a 300 grit sandpaper, 400, and you'll take a lot of the primer off, and then you'll start to see where the rough areas are, and you might want to keep adding wood filler. You might even want to start putting wood filler over the fillets here if you've got some roughness. Certainly sand these down where they're really smooth. A trick that I've done with the fins, I've taken a wood dowel like here, and I put kind of a coarse sandpaper. So when my rockets are still in a primer phase, you can actually come in and hold the dowel, and you can sand it like this, and this is what makes the real rounded edges. So when you sand it, this one wasn't used that way, but if I show you the gray one, you'll see how rounded the fillets are. I'll get that real quick. So this gray one had a lot of buildup. So if you look here, you can see how rounded those fillets are, and that's, you know, me just constantly going back and forth and adding more epoxy and doing the sanding with the wood dowel. So basically I just take coarse sandpaper, wrap it around, and tack it with thumbtacks, and then you just, you know, you sand it off like this. So this one, which I fly quite a bit, is in primer gray. I've done it a couple times to the point you don't see really any imperfections. This rocket is ready to be painted in final color, but I like to fly them a couple times in primer form. That way if there's any problem, any damages, or fins aren't secure, it's easy to patch it and correct the problem than it is when the final paint job. This is obviously a situation where I learned that lesson the hard way. So I would go ahead and at least get it in primer gray before we go on to steps 5 and 6. Okay, so we're going to assume the rocket has been painted, at least in primer form. And now you're ready to start working on the parachute assembly. So step 5 is basically telling you to take the shock cord that you fed through the rocket and tie it on to this part here. I'm going to tell you a few things to do that the instructions don't say that I found to help out. So first, you're going to take the, you get that, Jerry? You're going to take the shock cord and you're going to go through and you're going to basically make a slip knot. And what I like to do is I like to tie a knot at the end so it doesn't pull through, just for safety's sakes. But then I make a slip knot like this. You cinch that up, and once we make the knot, we pull it kind of tight, like that. Pull them tight, like that. So that's the knot that I use to tie it. Now I take, like I did with the other connection, and I found this really works well because I've actually tried to take these off before, and the masking tape really holds this knot together. So of course I got some old masking tape here, but the idea is you basically start right below the knot, you go around, you put this loose end down here, and you go around and you basically just kind of encase all the loose ends of the shock cord with the masking tape. So get a little more. I recommend using better masking tape than this, but there, that's better. So we'll go over the knot as well. And so once you get it around, then you just kind of squeeze it, make it conform to the shock cord, and that makes the connection to the nose cone. So the next step, step 6, tells you to attach the parachute. And this one also we do some modifications. So okay, so I take the nose cone, I put it next to the rocket, and that gives me kind of a halfway point on the shock cord. And the way I've been taught is you basically take halfway between this distance, or basically 1/3 of the way by it, the 1/3 side to the cone, and you take and you basically tie a loop like this and the shock cord. So the idea is when you stretch it out, you've got an area about a third, maybe that's a little less, from the shock cord to the main body. So it's 2/3 from this loop to the main rocket, a third from here to the nose cone. And this is where your parachute protector comes into play. So you take it out of the bag and you undo it, and the other connector that I told you to get from Lowe's, you basically put it through the loop and then you put it through the buttonhole that's pre-sewn in the fire protector, and then you take your parachute. I'm not sure if this is the same one that comes in the kit, but it's pretty close. And you should make sure your parachute, all the leads are pretty much at the same distance. So you got a loop here where all of them kind of come together. And you take that loop, actually I would open it up. So you just basically lay the parachute out flat. In all the parachutes, you either got 3 for a 6-sided chute, or you got 4 for an 8-sided chute. I can't remember what comes with the kit, but anyway, you take the loops and you bring them up together at a point like so, and then you pull it at the apex, and you just make sure you have all the end points pretty much the same. And so you've got a loop here with your finger, and you just put it on the same connection where the fire protection is, and you just cinch that down. And so when you're done, this is what you should have. You should have the nose cone, you should have the Nomex, you have the parachute, and you have the shock cord that you had created earlier. So that is the total assembly there. So the next video, I'll show you how to pack the chute and also load the rocket engine. But at this point, you can, if you want, you can pack the chute in and put some cloths in there, and now you can keep your protection on here, and you can paint the rocket, and then you can put the decals. Now the instructions here about the decals are pretty good. I can't overemphasize using the soapy water that they recommend. So although it's the traditional peel-off type, if you soak it in water and then brush on like soapy water here, and you put the decal on, you can move it around a little bit until the water starts evaporating, then it'll start bonding. So it allows you to kind of push and get all the bubbles out. So I recommend what they suggest here, using warm water and a little bit of soap to pre-wet the stickers. Basically you pull them off first, you put them in the water, and then you lay them out and have like a sponge or something to push out the air bubbles. But that's the assembly. So next video we'll be getting the rocket ready for flight.